Hello and welcome. This lecture will be broken up into two parts. In part 1, we're going to examine the arguments for thinking of religious ethics as a standard philosophical ethical theory. And in part 2, we're going to consider the structura of religious ethics and the benefits and problems that come with it. In the last lecture, we saw some arguments against religious ethics as actual philosophically valid ethical system. This time, we're looking to go beyond deflecting those arguments and actually asserting the legitimacy of the field. The reading for this lecture is one of my own, called Rational Religious Ethics, which I wrote specifically because I've had a great deal of experience dealing with various Eastern and Western religious ethical thought, but can't seem to find a textbook that bothers addressing these issues. Now, that may be in part because in most religions, the ethical ideas are mostly discussed in their legal or political systems, and since most philosophers are neither theologians nor lawyers, the entire field tends to be overlooked. My background specifically includes a master's thesis focused on religious ethical theories, in particular how they relate to war, so I happen to be an exception to the rule. Link to the thesis is in the description. The thing to note here is that we're not looking at any one religion in particular, but at religion in general, which covers at least the big six: Hinduism, Daoism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We're taking this general approach for several reasons. First, because the argument works across religions. It makes more sense to introduce it that way, and so avoid giving an overly narrow perspective. Second, because it covers a wide array of religious traditions, the argument actually tells us something about the idea of religion itself, rather than simply something about this or that tradition, which might otherwise be an exception. Finally, with this general approach, once we establish the structura of the system, it applies nearly universally across religious thought. You can plug in the specific terms or concepts from whatever religion you choose to get the specific structura of that specific religion. So for this lecture, we'll first get started with addressing the right of religious ethics to have the same philosophical consideration as other ethical theories, and then move on to the structura. The idea that religious ethics can be dismissed tends to come from the notion that religious ethical ideas are really just some old dude in the sky issuing orders as he sees fit, and that the only way to know right from wrong is by blindly following these orders. But that idea could only be true if religions claimed one of the following options. Option 1, that the text claims to prescriptively answer all possible ethical questions in all contexts directly and ahead of time. And no religion claims this because any text is inherently finite, but the range of human issues is infinite, so it can't all be decided ahead of time directly. Option 2. All adherents of the faith must have a direct line of reciprocal communication with the divine and get all their ethical questions answered that way, so there's no need for a book to do this. No religion claims this either. Option 3. All believers have access to a third party, a prophet, who answers all ethical questions by their connection to the divine, and this is the way to resolve ethical questions. Now, not only does no religion claim this idea, the idea has actually been proven as logically inconsistent by Al-Ghazali about 900 years ago. First, you would need as many prophets as you have people, and then they would have to follow their respective human around 24/7, because that's the only way to be able to answer all questions. Next, these prophets would actually have to just yell out things, because plenty of times you simply don't have the time to ask the question and hear the answer and then react in time. Or if you were to have a centralized prophetic figures to consult with, you just wouldn't have the time to make the trip, get the answer, and then get back to enact their answer in time. So that's not a functional option, and religions don't claim it. Option 4 is that the text would have to prescriptively cover all possible ethical questions because the rules are set in stone and no difference in context can matter. However, that would only work for religions that require that society and the believers be completely static, and the context of decision-making never changes. No major religion makes this claim either. So the idea that religions are just about blindly following the orders of some old dude in the sky does not work, because no religion makes that claim, and because of the options for that system don't work either. Thus, the justification for dismissing religiously based ethics do not hold up. What about the idea that there is a God? If that is an inherently incoherent idea, then the whole thing falls apart. Well, the concept of God, in general terms, is not incoherent. That is, it doesn't break the laws of logic, or the axioms necessary to support the idea are not incoherent, which means that it is at least possible. But philosophy is all about rational examination of ideas. Aren't religions based on blind following? Don't they have a shut up and believe attitude? Well, not in the least. At least the texts don't. I can't speak for the people who supposedly follow the texts. Hinduism, for example, is anchored on rational examination of the universe. If you check out the Bhagavad Gita, a core text, you'll notice that it is an intellectual argument made by God to man. Buddhism is founded on rational examination of the world, human nature, and optimization of human life. Daoism is premised on the rational study of all nature. Abrahamic traditions are entirely dependent on the use of reason. Wait, what? How so? Well, let's look at the text. The text of Abrahamic religions quite heavily depends on case studies, and all of the case studies have a very common theme that runs through them. A society goes bad by engaging in corrupt practices. A prophet is sent who asks, "Hey people, why are you screwing up?" And the people reply, "We are following in the footsteps of our forefathers." That is, they're blindly following without using reason. The prophet gives arguments, incentives, threats, which are rejected by the people who prefer their blind following of social custom to the use of reason. The prophet finally provides a miracle, and miracles are, by definition, arguments by demonstration. The people still disbelieve, and then the society is destroyed except for those who use their reason. Now, it should be noted that biblical miracles are actually a form of argument. When the guy who claims to speak on behalf of the Almighty splits the sea, that is a form of argument that he really does represent the Almighty. Similarly, when the supposed prophet brings the dead back to life and does so on schedule, that's an argument as to the force that backs his claims. Now, notice that the prophetic line is never "shut up and believe," and of course not. There is a message that is being given to people. The message cannot be understood other than rationally, any message. So, take for example the story of Moses, Old Testament or Quran. He is arguing with the Pharaoh. Arguing. The miracles are a way of demonstrating to the Pharaoh that when Moses says that he speaks for the Almighty, he really does speak for the Almighty. That is, it's an argument by demonstration that the Pharaoh is not contending with a human being. He is contending with something that is far above him, and therefore he needs to relent. Notice also that the failure to use reason is found not with the prophetic figure, but with the people who get the message but refuse to pay attention. Fine, some dude is making claims, but when that dude does the literally impossible and people still don't listen, the only conclusion that we can draw is that they're so blindly following their social customs that they are entirely submerged in their emotional investment, and so they are incapable of thinking. How can we be sure that we're not reading reason into these stories in a way that is not intended? How can we make sure that we're not misrepresenting the situation of actual religious texts? We can take a look back at previous thinkers, and sure enough, you find that the kind of rational analysis of all things religious was carried out by the varieties of saints and religious intellectual heroes long before secularism was a thing, and long before these thinkers would have had to contend with the kinds of questions that secular societies might throw at them. If the idea that reason is paramount was around back when the authority could have been used to simply force obedience of the population, then there is every reason to believe that this is not some new invention. Finally, the idea of religion being contingent on the lack of reason is ultimately untenable. Even in cases where the religious system has a strict hierarchy, and where the head of that hierarchy is godlike in their ability to make pronouncement, reason still outranks them. For example, papal authority is essentially absolute. However, even the Pope is bound by the rational rules of the text, and any pronouncement made in direct contradiction of that text would be rejected. But the path to such rejection could not come by any means other than reason, because all other paths are fully under the control of papal authority. But no matter the authority, a claim that, for example, Jesus was a woman would be rejected by the argument in reference to the textual pronoun, the rules of Hebrew and Aramaic grammar, etc., that is, by the use of reason. But some people argue that we can't take these texts seriously because they're man-made. Well, that's a bad argument, like just a bad argument. Because from that perspective, all texts are man-made, and we take Mill, Kant, and Aristotle seriously. So what's the difference between that and religious ethical texts? The fact that you know the author? All ethical systems, all of them, are metaphysical systems. They all rely on axiomatic assumptions. They are structurally the same. Kant assumes that the rational universalization of maxims is absolutely necessary as the core of any ethical thought. Mill assumes that the quantification of pleasure and pain of consequences of actions is absolutely necessary as the core of any ethical thought. These two systems are secular and based on reason, yet they're entirely incompatible. And this is because their axiomatic assumptions are different. However, there is no arguing about axioms because they are axioms. That is, they cannot be held for rational reasons, they must be assumed. We find the same axiomatic assumption as step 1 of religious ethics, quite usually called the Articles of Faith. But there is no functional difference between these religious axioms and the secular ones. In fact, trying to separate ethical theories on these grounds is far less meaningful than separating them on functional grounds, like do they have a concept of human rights? Kant and most religious ethics do, Aristotle and utilitarians don't. Now this is more functional because it actually tells you something about the theory, what you can get out of it, what kinds of extrapolations you can make, and so on. The religious-secular distinction is no different than saying that the axiom of one theory is different than the axiom of another theory. Well, no duh. That's what makes them different theories. And that much is equally true when comparing secular theories alone. So whether examining secular theories or religious ones, we have the same structure, the same methodology, and the same basis for disagreement. But what about development of those theories? Secular ethical theories are developed by human reason. What about religious ones? Turns out, religious ethics are just as much developed by reason as secular ones. Religious texts give you some core rules, a bunch of case studies, that's what those religious stories actually are, and then you have to use reason to apply these ideas to your own purpose and context, and that often requires a further development of the ideas to account for the new problems, new contexts, and so on. Take the idea of theft, which is immoral by most every theory. But then you get digital theft, digital piracy. Now, unlike normal theft, the digital version does not deprive the original owner of the object, which is the traditional definition of theft. So, is digital theft theft? How do we work that out? Well, people used reason based on core axiomatic ideas of their ethical systems, along with the rest of their developed theory, to arrive at the conclusion. Now, that's the exact same process for every single ethical theory, whether religious or secular. No one sat around waiting for God to speak to them to clarify the issue. So, this gives us a solid basis for religious ethical theories. Namely, they work and are workable in the familiar ways of other ethical theories. They start with the same axiomatic ideas, develop a theory, consider it in practice, and aim to develop a particular kind of world with particular kinds of outcomes. Well then, let's get to the structura and see how those systems work.